are listening to the podcast for learning the language of A Course in Miracles so you can understand the meaning, embody the message, and live the teachings as a way of life. Welcome to episode 17 of this podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Jennifer McSween, creator of this podcast, and the Course in Miracles practice coach for taking those who are studying the course from inspiration to application. The title of this week's episode is Relationships, the Classrooms for Learning to Release Judgment. Now, we think of relationships as the interactions that we have with one another, and from which we think we can grow and learn, and very often fulfill some perceived need that we think we're lacking. We also look at relationships in terms of an hierarchy, literally thinking and seeing some relationships as being more important than others. Romantic relationships, for example, are perceived as one of those that matter most, or at least we focus on the most. We tend to focus on the most. Overall, we seem to have the most resources and are usually more willing to invest time, energy, effort, and even money for that matter in our pursuit of romantic relationships and in trying to make those relationships work. Percentage-wise, as a matter of fact, there are many more romantic or couples relationship coaches, counselors, and programs in the coaching and counseling field than they are for other types of relationships, whether they be relationships among family members or relatives, relationships that occur in the workplace or in social situations. And we ourselves seem to be less willing, not that we won't, just that we're less willing and not as eager to invest our time, energy, effort, or money to heal or transform those seemingly secondary relationships as we do with romantic relationships. And whether the nature of the relationship is romantic, family, professional, or social, one of the other perspectives that we all seem to share is that in order for relationships to work, they require some form of give and take, some kind of mutual contribution and or support. In our romantic relationships, for that matter, it's often in the form of being treated in certain ways by our significant other. In families, it's parents expecting respect, obedience, and a certain standard of behavior or being related to or treated by their children. And in social relationships, it might be loyalty or some type of support in some way from our friends. Now, if we were to honestly and carefully examine our relationships, we would find that we all have expectations in different forms from most, if not all, of our relationships. Because the truth is that most relationships actually begin and end as a result of whether or not certain expectations seem to be present or are met. And these expectations are usually in the form of how we're treated, or by whether or not we feel those perceived needs we thought would be met are being met in that relationship, whether they're actually being done. Relationships are also one of the areas in our lives in which we feel most challenged, or that we tend to struggle the most. We can experience the greatest joys in relationships, and I'm talking here primarily romantic relationships. We can experience the greatest joys when it's unfolding in a way that we like. We can also experience the most profound sadness when a relationship comes to an end. And again, this is not uniquely or only with romantic relationships, but primarily so. We also have so many doubts and conflicts arising in romantic relationships. Whether it's trying to determine whether to leave or stay, being worried that we might miss learning a lesson or the lessons we think we're supposed to learn from being in a relationship. Not to mention concerns about what is or isn't going right with the relationship and all the perceived must-dos we think we need to do in order to have a loving, fulfilling relationship. From the perspective of A Course in Miracles, though, relationships are not interactions between people. According to the Course, just like everything else, relationships take place in the mind. One of the Course's most fundamental premises is that everything happens in the mind. What this means then is that we are in relationship with everything, whether it's a person, a thing, a situation, a circumstance, or a condition. Everything is a relationship, because the only place we're actually encountering, interacting with, and in turn relating to, no pun intended, anything is in our mind. You see, relationships only take place in the mind and are ultimately only between yourself and either Holy Spirit or ego, one of the two thought systems or perspectives from which you can choose to look at anything, and that determines how you experience anything. To understand this from the perspective of a Course, to understand this perspective of the Course towards relationships, you need to keep in mind the Course's analogy of life as a school and seeing everything that comes into your life or your experience as part of the curriculum. This means that whatever the circumstance, situation, or encounter in which you find yourself is nothing but a classroom for learning. The Course also teaches that there is only one lesson we're here to learn, regardless of the form of the classroom in which we find ourselves, or the form in which the lesson shows up. And the lesson is in no way related to, nor does it have anything to do with the form of the classroom or the specifics that seem to take place. In every situation, circumstance, condition, interaction, or encounter, the one lesson we are to learn is that which is talked about in the introduction to the text in the short form. And it's basically this. We are to learn to recognize that love is all there is, and love is what you are. And you do so by releasing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence. Judgment is a block, if not the block, to the awareness of love's presence. So this makes relationship, as the Course defines it, the perfect classroom for learning to release judgment. Here's why. From the perspective of the Course, relationships are in and of the mind. They are not specific forms of interactions or encounters we have with each other. That means that there is no hierarchy among relationships, nor are they for the purpose of meeting a specific need or any specific needs. What you experience in the form of happiness, joy, peace, pain, fulfillment, lack, or whatever it is you're feeling that you attribute to be the result of what is or isn't taking place in a relationship is nothing but you're experiencing the way you're looking at the relationship, what you're thinking and feeling about it. You're actually experiencing the nature of the thoughts you're thinking about that specific person and what is transpiring or unfolding or taking place, or what appears to be taking place. When you look at relationships within the context of what is taking place in your mind, or you're experiencing what is taking place in your mind, regardless of the form in which they occur, they now become classrooms to learn the one lesson we're here to learn, which is, again, to recognize the awareness of love's presence. And how we learn that lesson, how we recognize the awareness of love's presence, is by removing the blocks, which, as I said, are always in some form of judgment. So we first need to release our judgments, that is, our misperceptions, of relationships as interactions that take place and are perceiving to be in some form outside of us, as well as perceiving them to be in an hierarchy perceiving certain relationships to be more important than others. That's a misperception, that a judgment that we need to let go of. We also need to let go of the expectation that a relationship or any relationship is about some form of give and take in which certain needs are to be met. We now become aware that what we feel in any relationship is our experiencing our thoughts about that relationship and not caused by what does or doesn't take place in it. We also recognize that the true purpose of any relationship is not to give you anything or for providing a perceived lack, but for learning to recognize and release any and all thoughts that come up throughout the course of those relationships or any specific relationship that do not reflect the presence of love. This is how we release judgment and learn the one lesson that we're here to learn, which is love is all there is. What you are is love. And what we're here to do is literally extend and experience only love. So that's it for this week's topic on relationships, the classroom for learning to release judgment. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the podcast for Understanding the Language of A Course in Miracles. Tune in next week when I believe the topic will be the happy dream. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave me a review, subscribe so you don't miss another episode, and please invite your friends to listen. Have a great week, and see you on the podcast next Wednesday.